Welcome to our first plenary panel of the OCASI 2020 Executive Directors Forum, Dare to Dream, COVID-19 Reset. It is my great pleasure to introduce you to our moderator this morning, Manjeet Dhiman. Manjeet is a Senior Vice President of Services and Strategic Initiatives at Access Employment. Manjeet has over 20 years of experience in the nonprofit sector and is currently the Senior Vice President of Services and Strategic Initiatives. She provides leadership in the areas of collaborative service delivery, community engagement, program development, digital services, as well as marketing and communications. As the OCASI Board President, Manjeet provides strategic leadership to the Council and its member organizations. Manjeet has an MBA degree in Community Economic Development from Cape Breton University, a Bachelor of Science in Psychology from the University of Toronto, and a postgraduate certificate in Nonprofit Management from the Schulich School of Business. It is a great pleasure to introduce Manjeet Dhiman, our moderator for our opening plenary panel. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Debbie. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like to welcome everyone. I'm very pleased to be the moderator of this first plenary panel of the 2020 OCASI ED Forum. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. I myself am an immigrant from India. I arrived in Canada as a young child with my parents and have lived in the Greater Toronto area since we arrived. Our conference attendees and OCASI members are across Ontario, but here in Toronto, we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. This land is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. As service providers that support the settlement and integration of newcomers, we should look for ways to support Call to Action number 93 of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission by learning and sharing with our newcomer clients the inclusive history of diverse Aboriginal peoples of Canada. It may or may not surprise you to know that 85% of Indigenous peoples in Ontario live in urban areas such as Toronto. So we must work together, Indigenous and non-Indigenous organizations, service providers and governments in provincial and regional policy, as well as program design and delivery. Delivery that responds to the current and the future needs of our communities. And this is a great segue to the topic of this panel. COVID-19 is currently top of mind as the pandemic has created a new level of complexity and challenges to the important work that we do to support immigrants, refugees, and other residents of our community. Our lives have changed significantly. The online format of this conference speaks in part to our current reality. Individuals and businesses have implemented numerous policies and practices to stay home and stay safe. For some businesses, the pandemic has resulted in a dramatic decline or even complete shutdown. Other businesses have faced exponential growth and demand for their services and products. Amongst those businesses are nonprofits where leaders like yourselves are making difficult decisions, pivoting operations and changing the way programs and services are offered. COVID-19 has revealed and in fact deepened existing economic and social inequalities. This has been heartbreaking for us to see, but it is also an awakening of the broader population. The inequities and barriers that our clients face are more obvious than ever, and they cannot be denied or ignored any longer. Individuals and families who were already marginalized continue to face great, overwhelming challenges. As we weather this storm, we come to realize that things will never be the same again. Governments, institutions, and businesses are investing in rebuild and recovery efforts. Post-pandemic, a new normal will be established, many sectors and groups such as ours see 2020 as an opportunity for a reset. We have with us today a group of panelists who will reflect on what the future can look like when the nonprofit sector dares to dream. Our first panelist is Cathy Taylor. She has been a member since June 2012. Throughout her 25 plus years working in the nonprofit sector, including as the founding executive director of the Volunteer Center of Guelph, Wellington, she has been passionate about collaboration and leadership in the sector. Cathy works with sector colleagues from across Ontario and Canada, as well as private sector and government officials to create an enabling policy environment for nonprofit organizations. Chris Friesen also joins our panel today. Chris is the Director of Settlement Services for ISS of BC, and he is presently the chair of the Canadian Immigrant Settlement Sector Alliance, also known as CISA-XA. He is also co-chair of the National Settlement and Integration Council. Previously, Chris coordinated a British educational trust for refugees based in Nairobi, Kenya. Also on the panel is Paulina Wyrzykowski, who holds a Master of Social Work and a law degree from the University of Toronto. She practiced immigration law in Toronto before moving overseas to work as a senior research and advocacy officer with Makerere University's Refugee Law Project. Over the past 20 years, Paulina has worked on behalf of refugees and immigrants in Egypt, Canada, and Uganda. Paulina is currently the director of the Toronto South Local Immigration Partnership at the Neighborhood Group Community Services. And finally, Amanuel Melles, also known as Aman. He is the executive director of the Network for Advancement of Black Communities at York University, and he is the principal of Aman Consulting. He brings more than 20 years of senior management experience and expertise in settlement and immigration, community health, community development, community peace building, funding, and philanthropy. Aman held various senior roles with OCASI, Lawrence Heights Community Health, Family Services Toronto, and United Way Toronto. Aman serves on the boards of directors of various community groups and initiatives, and he was appointed by the Mayor of Toronto to the Partnership and Accountability Circle of Toronto's Confronting Anti-Black Racism 5-year plan. I have provided only the highlights of the experience and the expertise that our panelists possess. If you'd like to see their full biographies, they're available on the conference website. So at this time, I'm going to ask we're going to start with Cathy. At this time, I'm going to ask Cathy, Chris, Paulina, and Amanuel in this order to each provide us with a brief introductory presentation. After all 4 panelists have completed their presentation, I'll ask for their responses on a few questions that I would like to pose. And then we'll have an opportunity for them to respond to questions that you may have from the audience. So I'm going to turn it over to our first panelist, Cathy.
Wonderful. Thanks, Manjeet. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. It's truly an honor, and thanks to my collaborators at OCASI and fellow panelists. So 2020, what a year. Like, could we have imagined at the beginning what we would face globally, locally, as a result of the worldwide pandemic and all the related and unrelated inequalities and systemic issues that have surfaced, from economic inequality to systemic racism, compounded by climate emergencies and more. Our sector, the nonprofit and charitable sector, has, as we always have, stepped up, filled the gap, supported those that need our support the most. In some cases, we've even put our own organizations and employees at risk, as we've spent down reserves, used our own dollars, exacerbated conditions of perhaps an overworked and underpaid workforce. But I hear every day from colleagues across the sector that the adrenaline rush of moving virtual, of creating online programs, of finding short-term solutions for our program participants and staff is over, and that pandemic fatigue has really set in, and the uncertainty has become overwhelming. And yet, our sector is known as the doers. We get stuff done, but to what end? And that's what keeps me up at night. So before I talk about what I dare to dream about, I'm going to tell you what keeps me up at night. Our work is not sustainable financially and from a people perspective. What do we really need to be successful as nonprofits and charities? Are we tinkering around the edges as we create new programs that just continue to be Band-Aid solutions? Or are we doing transformational work that will strengthen our communities? How do we do both service delivery and focus on systemic change? What happens if ONN survey results from June come to pass and that 20% of nonprofits and charities, that's almost 10,000 nonprofits in Ontario alone, cease to exist in 2021? What would be the impact on our communities, and why aren't we all freaking out about that threat? How can we continue to support small organizations and community groups that are dying out? Is bigger really better when it comes to nonprofits and charities? And how can we truly capture this moment of change, particularly around inequality and systemic racism, and find strength and allyship in one another? Do we have the humility, the patience, and the strength as a sector to do things differently and learn and walk alongside one another? So getting to the dreaming part, when I dream big, and I rarely have had the time to do it recently, so I thank OCASI for making me sit down and think about it, because I know we're all overwhelmed with the minutia of getting through the day during this pandemic. How do I think we can move forward as a sector? I really believe that now is time for significant change, both being forced upon us and the opportunities to seize the day. And I vote for us to take the seize the day mentality to the change that we want to see going forward. We can drive that change rather than be passive observers, or even worse, fall prey to the, oh, woe is us, we don't have enough resources sector. By focusing on our communities and our missions, we will be more relevant, more successful, more strategic, and more recognized for the work that we do. So when I dare to dream, I think there's 4 key areas that I propose it's past due for us to reimagine in the nonprofit sector. Our role in systemic change. We cannot hide behind the mantra that we are just service providers and we're not experts on the systemic issues facing us. We are part of the system. We are the institutions that need to change. And we should never have, and certainly cannot now, ignore the fact that nonprofits and charities play a role in perpetuating and exacerbating economic inequality, racial justice, and white supremacy. If we expect governments and the private sector to transform, so should we. Second, decent work. If the future of work is care work, and the nonprofit sector then the nonprofit sector is the future of work. Yet it will be a lousy future if we continue to subsist on less than living wages, mediocre benefits, little professional development and advancement opportunities, and a lack of commitment to real diversity. We know that investing in our people pays off, and we need to walk the talk and create the workplaces of the future that we want. Third, in the area of governance, boards of directors are just one part of our governance ecosystem, and yet we've become trapped in the notion that only a few select board members that meet monthly, if that, in some cases, can lead and direct the important work our community does. Governance can be shared. There are few minimum requirements for the elected board, and we can create the governance system for our organizations that meets our needs, where we are at in our life cycle and our communities. And fourth, our business models and funding systems. The nonprofit and cooperative business models are essential and in fact the future of a more inclusive and equitable economy. Case in point, nonprofit long-term care. There were less COVID cases in nonprofit long-term care homes across the country by far, more investment in staff than in for-profit care. And it's time for us to take a significant look at the business models that underpin our sector and how they can be used to support the economy. We need to be bold and dream big about how our business model can transform our communities. And I would suggest that funders also have a role to play to help us transform, to move from less competitive models and less focus on counting pennies to more general operating support. And while we're at it, we'll take the time, we should reconsider the notion of charity and what that looks like at the federal level. So in dreaming big, I believe that the nonprofit sector is the future, and we are strong enough to influence and demonstrate the change we want to see, to stop being just gap fillers for services that shouldn't be left for us to do, certainly not in isolation, and speak up for the communities that need us the most. So thank you for the opportunity to provide some opening words, and I'd like to turn it over to Chris.
Thank you, Cathy. Good morning, everybody from the West Coast. If you can bring up my slides. Next. I want to start, I'm here with you here in Vancouver, and I want to start by acknowledging that I am gathered today on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nation. And like many of us here in the immigrant serving sector, we have embarked for many years now down this journey of reconciliation, trying to take leadership in how to better educate and orient newcomers that are accessing our agencies. And I have the privilege of living, working, and playing on these unceded territories of the Coast Salish people. Next, please. Does space still matter? Geographical location still matter? In short, yes, but. We've all seen the acceleration of settlement service delivery to online, and this will have far-reaching implications going forward. Hybrid service delivery approach is here to stay. What does this mean? Will we need all the current providers? Is the future likely to see more mergers, increased agency closures, more hub and spoke type models for large geographical region? Is it the growth of larger providers? If link CLB classes, for example, 6, 7, 8 classes can successfully be delivered remotely online with newcomers with digital literacy and access to technology, so why couldn't a link provider offer online classes beyond their current geographical locations? We know now that a segment of newcomers, perhaps as much as 1 in 4, are quite happy never to step foot in an agency again. Does this mean that service utilization rates might increase due to technology embracement and newfound service accessibility because we can now provide services beyond the 9 to 5? Is it out of the realm of possibility to imagine, for example, a multilingual settlement telephone helpline for the entire province, staffed by trained settlement workers, targeting information and orientation, service linkage for primarily low digital literate newcomers? You know, going forward, newcomers seeking services will be divided into 2 main categories, 2 streams. And those streams will be along digital literacy lines. And IRCC funded agencies will be expected to track and report based on in-person and online. Next slide, please. The big question, what happens in 2022? Immigration levels are down, likely by 60% in 2020. Additionally, Minister Menachino is, only a week or so away from announcing the immigration levels for 2021 to 2023. And particularly looking to next year, the target, whatever Minister Menachino announces in the coming week, next year will be outside of his control, outside of the government's control. And likely the numbers will significantly be down again due to ongoing border closures, reduced air travel, overseas COVID hotspots, and overall reduced capacity on IRCC processing. IRCC themselves have acknowledged that they're working at about 60% capacity. So regardless of what the targets are, there are so many external factors that will be beyond the government's control looking at the immigration levels next year. And now let's peel back. What happened this year in 2020? Who are the permanent resident landings? Over 40% of 2020 permanent resident landings did not come from abroad. They were already in the country as temporary residents. This is going to have, and of course, we all know that temporary residents, for a variety of reasons, are less likely to access settlement services. So will this be the pattern again next year? Is there a significant enough volume of temporary residents still in the country that will consider converting their status to permanent residence? So 2022 is the first time the sector will embrace itself and will be hit by the impact of the settlement allocation model and that 3-year backward rolling average. I think it's about hoping for the best, but expect cuts, possibly as early as next April. Later this fall, we may have some indication of that if there is a federal financial update, or we may have to wait until early next year for the federal budget. But this will signal a big indicator as to how we are going to have to brace ourselves as a sector. Next slide, please. So, dare to dream. It's time to push on. It's time to embrace, to come together as one sector, to look at some, I think, low-hanging fruit. We need to engage at a federal political level to push for a cabinet submission to change the IRCC settlement program eligibility to include temporary foreign residents. COVID has shined a light on the lack of a pan-Canadian universal support and safety net for temporary foreign workers, seasonal agricultural workers, refugee claimants, and international students. It's time for us to come together and advocate on a federal political level in the inclusion of temporary residents on program eligibility. When I talk about that, I don't mean that every temporary resident should have the ability to access every current federal settlement service program, but there are key areas. And looking back to what I said earlier about the fact that 40% of temporary residents will or are currently converting their status to permanent residents, this only makes logical sense of early intervention, prevention, and including them now as they will become future Canadians. Additionally, we need to push for greater flexibility of IRCC contribution agreement, the current model that we have been advocating for years. And with the caveat of COVID and the fact that the department is only operating at a 60% capacity, this is our opportunity to really come together and highlight some priorities. I would argue that the one that we should be embracing and advocating collectively has to do with the ability to transfer unexpected revenue or slippage from one fiscal year to another within the lifespan of a contribution agreement. For so many years now, we have struggled with this notion of, oh, we have slippage. How do we reinvest it? And sometimes not particularly important investments in the last quarter of the fiscal year. This piece, if we were able to focus our energy and negotiate this win-win with the department of being able to transfer slippage from one fiscal year to another, this would open up far greater opportunity and flexibility for us. So that's what I dream about. Thank you very much. So over to you, Paulina.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I am incredibly honored to be here, and I'm actually going to change tack a little bit and begin with a personal anecdote. So when I was 14, I watched the Berlin Wall fall on television in Toronto. And it was the first time in my life that I became really acutely aware that seismic, seemingly overnight shifts in the world are possible. While I had been growing up in Poland up till the age of 10, my entire family had assumed that the Soviet Union was immutable. We didn't particularly like it, but we thought it was there to stay as far as we knew forever. And it was a big part of why we left. In retrospect, there had been cracks in those structures, but they were obscured by the everyday business of living. I had that feeling of queasy excitement and apprehension again this March when the shutdown began. I had the feeling that things would never be the same. And that the world that we would be going back to would be quite different than what we had lived up until now. And I think the one thing that my experience has taught me is that we need to really think big and be visionary at this point, because what happens now could change our world for at least a generation or more. It's not business as usual. COVID is a system breaker. It unearthed things that are normally hidden, like the power relations that govern our society. It has made evident and clear the growing inequalities in our society. My fear is that our reflex is to try to go back to normal as soon as possible, to try to just bring back what we know. And what that can lead us into is denial and letting events overtake us. It could lead us to a place where we let others dictate the agenda for us. So what I would like to emphasize in my opening remarks is that now is the time for the immigrant sector, serving sector, to look for allies, not just to get caught up in our own struggles, which are considerable, and as Chris rightly pointed out, are likely to continue being considerable, but to really think more broadly about what it is, what kind of a society is that we want, and how to get there, and who can help us get there. So what are some of the big opportunities that I think lie ahead? One is the opportunity to really address white supremacy. I think that one of the things that COVID has really highlighted are the social inequalities that fall not just along purely economic lines, but also along racial lines. The broader public is now aware, much more so perhaps than they were several months ago, of who it is that provides the essential services that really keep our economy and our society going when everybody else is hiding. I think this is an opportunity. I think we have an opportunity to really lessen the economic inequality through pushing for decent work, pushing for things like universal basic income. Again, I think it has become harder for the mainstream public to pretend that they don't know that personal support workers are underpaid, for instance, that grocery workers are underpaid, that those growing inequalities are pushing more people into poverty. I believe we should take advantage of that and ally ourselves with those campaigns already out there that are pushing to lessen those inequalities. And finally, I think we have the opportunity to capitalize on emerging technological opportunities and ensuring that that access to technology is equitable. I absolutely agree with what has been said before. Chris mentioned that settlement services will likely be delivered in a dual model going forwards, both online and in person. I absolutely think that is the way that things will progress. I think it is our responsibility to keep pointing out that if services are increasingly being offered online, then they have become a human right. Access to services is a human right, and that means access to internet is a human right. And so we should be joining those campaigns that exist, that are pushing for universal, reasonably affordable access. This is not just a settlement issue. This is bigger than our sector. It needs to be done in conjunction with others. Because so many of these goals are huge, they're societal level goals. We don't need to be the drivers behind all of them. We need to find the right allies, and we need to identify where we have specific expertise to contribute. If we don't do this, other agendas will prevail, and the sector might be transformed in dystopian ways. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time, now that I've told you what my dreams are, in a way, I'm going to spend a little bit of time telling you what my nightmare is. I think some of the big risks are increasing threats from the far right and from white supremacist violence. We are seeing destabilization down in the South. We should remember that some of the drivers of that destabilization, such as the Proud Boys, are actually have their origins in Canada. We are not immune here to xenophobia and racism by all means, by any means. I'm very concerned, as Cathy pointed out, I am very concerned about the weakening of civil society as a result of NGOs, including those in the settlement sector, but not only those in the settlement sector, collapsing due to COVID-related revenue loss and subsequent austerity measures. Cathy spoke a little bit about this. I want to cite one of the ONN reports recently that recently found that 1 in 5 nonprofits to disappear within 6 months. We cannot have a strong civil society without strong nonprofits, and we cannot face and overcome the challenges posed by white supremacy and the threat of far-right racism without a strong civil society. Along the same lines, I fear an all-encompassing privatization, which leaves the most vulnerable segments of society behind and further heightens existing inequalities. I think there will be a great temptation for the government during COVID recovery to try to bolster private services and push privatization as much as possible as the cost-effective way to deliver services, despite the clear weaknesses we have seen in the old age care homes during COVID. I fear that if that model is allowed to predominate, it means that those most vulnerable will fall by the wayside and our sector will effectively disappear. My final message is that this is not the time for our sector to be siloed. We should not be staying on the sidelines. I think that historically we have worked to integrate newcomers, often by showing individuals how to fit into the society. And there's great value in that. But I think we also have a role to play in asking what makes for a welcoming society. How should we change this society so that rather than just applying Band-Aid solutions, we create a place where immigrants are truly welcome and where they have a voice? How can we, as organizations representing newcomers and that are ourselves in many cases newcomer organizations, influence this public discourse, this giant societal shift that is taking place so that we are not just passive observers? And I would say that doing whatever it takes to bolster a strong civil society in Canada is key to ensuring that COVID leads to a just recovery and a just society, not just a return to the status quo or worse than what we had before. Thank you.
I guess it's my turn. It's Amanuel, Melles. Thanks again, OCASI, for inviting me to be part of this really privileged in a way in terms of thought leadership panel. I think the coming out of a national 2 days conference on anti-Black racism last week, a lot of the points that were made by my fellow panelists resonate a lot already, because when we talk about, daring to dream and taking stock of the current situation for the sector, a lot of the points that I'm going to share with you actually amplify some of the points that were already made by my panelists. I think let me start where we are in terms of the current situation. I think as a student of history myself, when I look at the last time the Spanish flu was around, it lasted a solid 2 years before things started to shift a little bit. Obviously, we are in a different technological and medical context at the moment, but as we start planning for 2021 and beyond, I think the lingering effects of this pandemic will be with us, and so we have to really put that as an important factor in whatever thinking that we're doing. Yeah, so it's here to stay for some time before perhaps it will be better. The other thing for the context for me, obviously for all of us, is we have had another type of pandemic here, which is kind of the intense assault of anti-Black racism locally, globally, and Canada-wide. So that's also an important, consideration in our conversations. And I think what does it actually mean when Black communities locally and nationally and globally are under huge attack on many fronts in terms of anti-Black race. So I think one of the things that we found really interesting in our conversation last week with peers across the country is like, the fight against anti-Black racism is equally a fight against anti-Indigenous racism, yeah? Or it's so intersected with other, forms of discrimination that all of us as society, want to get away with. And I think Paulina mentioned some of those points. It's very important for us to remain vigilant against, Islamophobia and any form of anti-Semitism or, all the attacks that we see in terms of homophobia and attack on LGBTQ. So the intersectionality of this discussion is critically important. The pandemic is there, yes. The anti-Black racism there is, yes. But also there are all sorts of important intersectional points that we need to bring to the discussion. And that's why I think when I look at the challenges and the call of leadership of this moment, I cannot but think about being critical and introspective about my own role as a leader, but also my own placement in the ecosystem working with others. And I think the point that Paulina made, which I amplify here, is like, we need to start thinking about how do we break the sectoral silos that we have. Because I'm a part of a number of circles and conversations, and I see these conversations, happening in different tables, and I say, what's the common denominator here? What are some of the things that need to bring all of us together to really be on the same page and focus our energy and fight in terms of coming out of this time? And I think for me, there are a few things there. Obviously, from the work that we do and where I am, I think this is not new. I mean, the degree and scale of the challenge for Black communities might be new with the pandemic and the intensity of the assault on anti-Black racism. But when Harper, defunded the settlement sector in 2008 and 2009, it was no surprise that the organizations that really struggled to remain viable were racialized, agencies that were serving, newcomer communities that are Black and racialized in nature. So some of the organizations disappeared. Some remain incapacitated to this very day. So to some extent, we have a bit of a lesson from a recent history and say, what would happen, come, next 2-3 years, as Cathy was indicating from the survey that they have done. There will be perhaps a reconfiguration of the landscape here. But I think what we as society and as sector leaders do, we need to agree to protect as a minimum standard for communities. What needs to be there to ensure that there is viability, while at the same time we're not shying away from embracing the adversity of the moment and saying, what opportunities do we have here to actually innovate and come with new organizational models to support some of the work ahead. And I think in our work with Black communities, there's no question that the majority of players in the Black community that are really closer to the problem and doing work are grassroots Black organizations and informal groups. And they are an important part of the ecosystem. So I think for us, when we start to imagine the future in terms of recovery, we cannot but pay attention to the grassroots so that we avoid some of the mistakes of the past when we had the recession and the intentional defunding of the settlement sector in 2008 and 9. So I think, as a sector, we need to be able to say, let's be intentional about breaking the sectoral silos that we have. The discussion that happens around recovery for the nonprofit charitable sector that happens at Imagine Canada level, at the ONN level, at the OCASI level, at the NAPSI level, at the different sectoral tables that's happening, needs to connect somehow. We need to find a way to be able to say, here are some principles and values that should guide our work collectively to really be sectoral advocates for the types of change that we need to do. The other thing is it's time for us to be leading by example. By that, I mean and a number of my panelists, I think, alluded to that. I think as sector leaders, we need to be able to say, in terms of equity and inclusion, how are we faring? what's kind of our own scorecard here? Are we doing what we can to actually be inclusive and pay attention to equity? Often we are good advocates for equity and inclusion, but we need to look at the mirror and say, how are we failing ourselves? Are we being intentional in terms of really including the voices that are not at the table? So I'm really pleased when last week in our national conference, we had our sector allies in a panel with us, as we are having today, as I can see the schedule for the ONN conference looks. So we need to be able to be intentional to bring the various voices at the table in terms of inclusion and equity work. Because at the end of the day, we don't want it to be good advocates for equity and not leading by example. And I think in moments such as this one, I think there's no missing of words around this work. When we talk about anti-racism, we're talking about anti-Black racism here. There are particular forms of racism that manifest themselves differently, that impact Black communities differently, that we need to name, acknowledge, and have strategies to deal with. But we do that also, again, in the context of fighting all intersectional points of racism and discrimination. But we cannot allow the fight against anti-Black racism to be watered down and lost in the fight against anti-racism. Yes, we are anti-racists, but we have to be anti-Black racists at the same time, because the data is leading us there. And that's the other point that I wanted to bring in this discussion. We need to follow the data. The reason that last week at our national conference, we didn't invite academicians and researchers to talk about the data and what needs to be done is that we know what needs to be done. Yes, we need to raise awareness, but also we need to be able to act. The other important piece, I think, is there are some universal solutions here. I mean, the recommendation around universal basic income, for example, there are some universal solutions that are important for us to advocate because they affect everybody positively. I would love to think that the effective determinants of settlement are nothing but the social determinants of health. It's very important for us to really ally our voice with the Black health leaders that have called for a certain change in terms of the work around social determinants of health. Settlement is related to employment, to housing, and all other aspects of the determinants. So again, here's our opportunity for us to really be able to work with other sector leaders to bring about the type of change that's needed. We've been talking a lot in our steads, in our spaces about an ecosystem approach, that we cannot anymore look for compartmentalized solutions to our problems in our communities. Our challenges are holistic. In the context of Black communities and many other racialized communities, they are generational. They cannot be only disappearing or be treated by funding programs and services. That's why the point that earlier Cathy was making about systems, it's critically important. At NAPSI, we've been really challenging positively our funding colleagues and said, we need you to be able to move to smart grant making. Yes, services and programs are important, project dollars are important, but we need to start thinking that our problems are generational and require systems level solutions, medium to long term. So systems change is important and a smart grant making is important. The other piece that is very important for all of us to think is like, is there another order of challenge for all of us that we need to pay attention at the moment? And I strongly believe there is one, which is the need for us to really link our work around racial justice with the climate justice work. We cannot ignore the issue of climate justice and climate crisis and climate change in the context of the work that we do. Because for me, that is a huge meta-analysis level that needs to inform the work that we have to do. So there are three principles that I would love to bring to this discussion for all of us to consider as we move forward. One is, I think there's a lot of stuff that's working already. When we think about the recovery in the future, we must amplify what's working. Very important, amplify what's working. The number 2 principle that guides our work at the moment is, course correct what's not working. Have those courageous but difficult conversations among ourselves so that we can course correct them with care and empathy. The third important principle that guides our work is when it's critically needed and missing, let's be bold enough to introduce it. So in terms of a couple of dreams that I have for us to consider in this work is like, yes, we need to go for just recovery. And I think it's important for us to work at level to introduce, initiatives and structures that actually allow us to deal with long-term inequity that exists. In the context of Black communities, we're asking funders openly, move away from throwing money at the problems in the Black community. Create an ecosystem approach to really work with a number of players, governments, funders, corporate leaders, faith leaders, community leaders, using almost an ecosystem approach. That's what TRIAC did many years ago, dealing with the international educated employment problem, the Toronto Region Immigrant Employment Council. Let's have a TRIAC moment for our challenges, if you want, and let's sit around the table, bring all the actors and find medium to long-term solutions. And one of the propositions that we have is, I think it's important for us to really have the ability in the context of racialized communities and Black communities, the ability to raise money and fund Black communities without totally depending on funders and foundations. Those are important partners, but it's important for us to really think about creating a Black philanthropic foundation in this country that really supports the recovery efforts in the Black community. I'll stop here, and I'm happy to be able to share with my panel later on additional points. But if there was one word that Cathy mentioned that I often speak is there's no time to tinker at the edges. This is a bold moment, and we need to be able to really be ready to take bold actions in terms of moving forward. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Cathy, Chris, Paulina, and Amanuel. Your insights so far have been very, very helpful. I have a few questions that I'd like to ask. I'm going to start, first of all, by just saying I know that all of us in this sector are doing everything we can to plan ahead. And we're listening into every news story, everything we can get our hands on to help us to plan ahead. We're hearing from so many theorists, economists, and experts that the pandemic has instigated changes that will be long-lasting or maybe permanent. Essentially, that a new normal will emerge. I heard a couple of the panelists say that in some ways we need to resist going back to what the reality was before. I think pre-COVID, there were some great things that we want to get back to, but on the other hand, there were some great things that some horrible things that we want to change. So Cathy, in your introduction, you spoke about the importance of innovation and improved compensation as just a few examples of how we really want to build the capacity of organizations and the sector as a whole. Tell me a little bit more about how you think we should evolve and adapt to this new normal that we are planning for.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a great question, Manjeet. I think, I think there's already been examples of how the sector is evolving, even since March. How we're becoming more technically savvy and transforming digitally. Things that we've talked about for a long time, but never, either had the resources or the equipment or the reason to do those things. So I think there's a number of examples already out there about creative programming, about digital transformation, about changes in spaces. I also see a lot of collaboration happening on the ground, not only within organizations, but between subsectors in our own sector. So for example, arts organizations partnering with a food bank to deliver services in a small community. I'm seeing some of our policy work that ONN has taken on be aligned with the Chamber of Commerce, which may not have happened in previous iterations. So we are finding partnerships and collaborations and different ways of doing work, which I think is actually quite exciting when we think about how we can move forward. I definitely believe that if we focus on our missions and what our communities need, that will help us go forward rather than focusing on our organizational structures or how the organization used to operate, because those days are changing now. So I think if we focus on what we really want to get done for our communities, it will open our perspectives into other partners, other funders, other donors, other community service ways of other ways of delivering our services, more opportunities to advocate together, which I think is pretty exciting. And so I think with a laser focus on our missions as nonprofits and charities, that will help us lead the way in the new normal.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Cathy, point well taken. I think that many of us had plans in place for a slow evolution of our organizations, things like adopting technology, which we were doing slowly, but I think the pandemic has been a great opportunity to really accelerate those plans and just move in leaps and bounds. So I totally agree there is an opportunity here to move ahead. Would any of the other panelists like to comment on how our sector should evolve and adapt to this new normal?
I think this is part of our new reality. As I said, hybrid service delivery, the use of technology, further exploration in the use of technology is here to stay. And what is, I think, going to be challenging, of course, is the unequal capacity that exists in the sector. Those, smaller agencies delivering critically important, high quality contributions to their communities will not have the same capacity as those of larger agencies. So this is something that is a reality.
Mm-hmm.
I think that we should move forward in a values-driven way. And what I mean by that, it piggybacks on things that both Amanuel and Cathy have pointed to, that when we look for allies, we need to figure out what our core values are and ally ourselves with those whose core values are the same as ours or very close to ours. And I think that if we move forward in that fashion, we will be able to adapt without losing what we consider most important in our sector. But I do think we need to have a clearer idea first in terms of the immigrant serving sector of what our values as a sector are. And I think that's part of what Amanuel was alluding to as well.
And a quick one, Manjeet, for me, perhaps this is something through the leadership of OCASI can be done. I strongly believe, having played a role in the sector over the years, that this sector actually has a lot of adaptive capacity. Like you introduced the settlement services in the schools, settlement service in libraries. You have had the local immigration partnership tables. There were different things that the settlement sector has done. What perhaps is needed now is like, I sit on the Social Innovation Institute Board of Directors, and it's like, why is social innovation is such a, unique thing out there? Every sector should be able to actually embrace innovation and drive innovation. Yeah. So for me, I think when I look at the sector and OCASI and similar OCASI like players across the country, it's like, if you go through a review of what really over the years when the sector experiences shocks in terms of major funding cuts, and so how did you adapt to that? And you start really picking one or two things that you might want to bring back here and say, how do we build adaptive capacity? Because I often mention in my work some of the work that the sector has done in terms of really building adaptive capacity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Yeah, definitely. I think with this pandemic, technology and technology development has been a leading area. But I think the pandemic, there's almost called the second pandemic, is the fact that COVID-19 has really disproportionately impacted racialized and low-income communities. In many ways, this has amplified and increased anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism. As I mentioned, it's being called the sort of second pandemic. I appreciate, Amanuel, your comments earlier about the importance of us not only being advocates, but being role models and leaders in our own actions. And I think one of the panelists or a few people mentioned earlier that some of these inequities that we're seeing in the broader population also exist in our sector. So what can we do as role models, as leaders, and as advocates to ensure that we are addressing these issues that are so important? I'll start with you, Amanuel.
Thanks, Manjeet. I think we need to be practical in a sense that, the reason we really organized a national conference on anti-Black racism with an eye on concrete actionable things is that, we know what needs to be done. I think the data is there, and I think the will to act must be there. And I've seen during this pandemic, governments and funders bending their own rules and introducing all sorts of new practices. So if there's a will, there's a way. So I think for me, in your opening remarks, you made reference to the TRC, for example, Manjeet, in terms of recommendation 93. In the sector, beyond issuing statement, how do we actually address concretely, some of the recommendations of TRC, And so for us, I think there is an opportunity here to be able to say, we know enough in terms of the disproportionate impact on racialized communities and indigenous communities. And if we wanted to act, we cannot act independently talking about the needs of our sector only. I cannot have a discussion with funders and ministers, and my fellow Black leaders across the country to talk about anti-Black racism without paying attention to anti-Indigenous racism or other intersectionalities that I was mentioning earlier on. So I think for us, we need to be able to say, as a sector, here's how we are concretely living allyship. Yeah, these are one of the things that we can do. And I think in terms of the disproportionate impact, it's very sad. I mean, what's bad about this pandemic, it's killing people, and it's killing people of color. And so what we need to do is that we have to keep governments accountable. When Black health leaders talk about the collection of race-based data, and when we have a session last week talking about the collection of race-based data, this is consequential discussion. We're talking about lives here, folks. And so I think it's very important for us to keep the government's feet to fire, so to speak, but also to ask ourselves, am I doing enough to really advocate for what matters at the end of the day? And when I'm sitting around a policy table with elected officials and so on, there's nothing that irks me more than leaders talking about their own small shop stay issues. We need to be able to step back and say, hey, the pandemic is really killing people of color here. With the assault on anti-Black racism, there's so much happening in this freaking country around these issues. I'm a bit, mad about this because, my own colleague's mother-in-law passed away of COVID, And so at the end of the day, these are issues of life and death for marginalized communities. So what do we need to do? Enough is talk about data. Let's act on the data. What do we need to do? Let's lead by example. We cannot advocate about inclusion and equity if we look around and everything around us is not equitable and inclusive. So Cathy, kudos to you. Next week at your conference, you're opening up your conference in terms of a commitment to ensure that at least 50% of your speakers and participants are people of color. I know OCASI's conference has been doing this for ages, but that's a concrete thing to do. I'm sick and tired of reading land acknowledgements. We need to be able to really work together to move to a different space, to act and bring about change.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you, Amanuel. I open it up to the other panelists to give your thoughts on, again, this opportunity to really look at diversity, inclusion, equity, anti-Black racism anti-Indigenous racism as really important issues that need to be tackled. Cathy, did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, no, it's hard to follow Amanuel because of his passion and expertise on this issue so well. I totally agree with him. I think, and many of us are practitioners. We're practical people that, you know, run organizations or lead organizations, and we want to know what to do, and people want to act. And I've never seen such a will in the last 6 months. I didn't see it the same way before, I think, in our sector, and so many questions that we're getting, that I know my panelists are getting, that OCASI is getting about what they should do and how they can support. And I really believe, I strongly believe what Amanuel has said, that we just need to do something. We need to lead from example. We need to do something concrete, whether it's a starting position around our staffing, our boards, the people that are involved in our decision-making processes, how we do our events, how we collect data about our, but then contribute to the systemic issues at the same time. I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. I think we can do some of the practical things inside our organizations. And I know what ONN is our focus, and our board has made a commitment to an anti-Black racism strategy. And we are looking at it in 3 ways. You know, what do we need to do differently at our own organization, our HR, our governance, our leadership? Secondly, what do we need to, how do we take anti-Black racism lens to our policy work, our public policy work that we do? And then thirdly, what's our role as a network, like with NABC, with OCASI, with others? You know, how can we play a leadership role in the network? And we're going to struggle with figuring out what that is over the next few months. We're going to make some mistakes. We're going to hold ourselves to account, and hope that our partners hold us to account when we do make a mistake, and help us, you know, get up and do it again. And so I think, I really believe that it's time for us to take a stronger position as a sector on some of these issues. It's not too late. It probably feels like it's too little too late, but there is an opportunity in front of us. And if we pair that with the changes and the transformation that our sector is going to go through anyway, let's just, you know, put it all on the table and really learn to do things differently.
Paulina,
and I think we are going to make mistakes, right? Yeah. What I see in the sector now is I see a lot of sort of intellectual and ideological commitment to changing things and to really looking at ourselves. But where it runs into problem is when people put on their executive director hats, where they have to think about liability, and they have to think about, you know, public perception, and they have to think about funders. And a lot of these great initiatives stall because they're worried about making a mistake. They're worried about making an HR mistake, about the wrong thing coming out. I don't see an easy solution to that, but I think we have to be willing to take those risks.
I think it also is a recognition that this is not, there's no silver bullet. This is a journey. And I think it starts with having courageous discussions within your own agencies, the policies that you have in place, engaging more widely. We talk about race data, but are we doing that even within our organization to better understand where our staff are, who they are, what positions of power they have within our organizations? These are all things that I think have to be considered. There's a policy lens. There's also, and as part of that courageous discussions is understanding that racism is very dynamic. And what are we doing in our role in integrating newcomers around educating newcomers, educating our staff with an anti-racism lens. But I think it starts, if it hasn't already, I think it starts with having courageous discussions and being willing to make mistakes, understanding and recognizing that there is mistakes, understanding and recognizing the positions of power that we have, whether that's related to where we were born or raised, or whether that is the position within our organization. But I think it starts with courageous discussions and understanding that mistakes will be made, They're not intentional going to be, we don't want to, intentionally make mistakes, but there will be. And this is part of the journey. But it really needs to start, it's not only in the broader society, but it really needs to happen within our own, in our case, immigrant serving agencies.
Thank you so much. So again, the theme of today's panel is Dare to Dream. And I know that we have talked about some of the nightmares that we have, but also some of the dreams that we have. So, just going back to that visioning and that dreaming of what the world can look like post-pandemic, let's talk a little bit more about the transformation that we need to undergo. And maybe, Paulina, I can start with you on what do you think are some of the opportunities that we have for transformation as a sector post-pandemic?
So my big dream for the sector is that this will get us out of the habit of siloing ourselves. I think that historically the immigrant serving sector has been fairly siloed. We've been very focused on sort of immediate service delivery. There's notable exceptions to this. There are organizations that have always partnered well and have done a lot of advocacy, but I think in general, when I speak to most executive directors, often they just feel very overwhelmed by the day-to-day. And so it's difficult to look beyond sort of the next step for our clients and really beyond our sector and beyond our sector's own troubles, as it were, and interests. And I think this is really an opportunity to do that and to become more political in a way that the sector has historically, I would say, somewhat resisted. In concrete terms, I think the biggest struggles are going to be around anti-racism. I think that's a huge battle to be fought, and we're uniquely positioned to fight it because we are an immigrant serving sector. We see the examples of racism and xenophobia every day. We can speak to it. And then I think that there's also the technological transformation that's sort of being thrust upon us, but I think we can take charge of that, and I think it can lead to really great things.
Two points, Paulina, you just mentioned. First, around breaking silos. And I know I see we'll get to questions from the audience in a moment, but that theme is also coming up. That, it's one thing to say it, how do we do it, right? It seems overwhelming. And I think we're in a sector where we value collaboration, but there's the reality of just the busyness. There's some competition amongst us. So let's really talk about how do we break down those silos a little bit further. And I welcome comments from everyone on that.
So I've actually thought about this quite a bit. And I think that, again, what we need to start with is values. We need to start with what the values of our organization are. We need to identify which allies potentially align with those values. And we need to identify priorities in terms of which areas of focus is our organization uniquely qualified to contribute to. Do we specialize in mental health? Do we have something unique to say about that others might not? Where can we contribute around that? Is it around how we approach our work? Is it around governance? Do we have something unique in terms of organizational structure that we want to share? I think those are discussions that are worth having internally first, so that then we can really choose the campaigns we can contribute to and partners that we ally with around values.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Any other comments on breaking silos? Cathy, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I very much agree with Paulina. I would also say that it's not actually hard work. It really is about relationship building, and our sector is good at relationship building, whether it's with our funders or our donors or our clients or our staff. So it's just another level of relationship building. And sometimes it's a cold call. We pick up the phone to an organization in our community, to a partner, to say, how can I help? What are you working on? Do we have anything in common? Can we, there's a campaign that we want to, that we're thinking of. What do you think? And to really reach out and build those relationships. And I think sometimes we make it seem more more complicated than it is, that we need, a structure and a strategy, and we need all of the key messages in place, and many of the advocacy campaigns that ONN's been working on, it truly is, what are you hearing? What are you doing? What are we doing? Let's figure it out. And it's a bit messy as in a network model sometimes, but that's how we get to the next level. And I would also add that nonprofits and charities are uniquely positioned as a bridge between our communities and our governments. We know, we might not call ourselves experts, but we're experts on what we hear from our communities and what they're going through. And we need to think about how we can play that role as the bridge going forward. And we can be a bridge with other organizations as well.
And I think, go on, Chris.
No, you go ahead.
No, go ahead, Chris.
No, I'm just saying, as a sector, we hold unique information that is not replicated by the private sector or any other social service sector. Our work in community with newcomer families gives us a unique vantage through our work on the front line. We're nation builders. Our work is all about social cohesion. I think one of the things that we can do, again, is continue to challenge some of the advocacy bodies to ensure that they have and are being driven through a settlement-informed lens, whether that's work around poverty, whether that's work, in other areas. We have a responsibility in the work that we do on a day-to-day basis in local communities with newcomers to ensure that when they, because for a variety of reasons, cannot speak yet on their own behalf, it is our responsibility to help and ensure that their voice is heard at these broader coalition tables. A settlement-informed lens.
I think what I was going to add quickly is, which the points that made resonate with me. I think the only thing I would add is where there are two things. One, active tables, sector tables that are engaging governments at different levels, whether it's municipal or provincial or federal. We must make sure that the key sector players across the country are at the table. Inclusion starts there, breaking the silos starts there, yeah. So how do we do that? If ONN is at the table, or NAPS is at the table, or OCASI is at the table, we should be able to say, hey, there are important other sector leaders and organizations that must be at this table, yeah, at this policy table. So that's one way we break silos. The other thing is recovery is all about, transformation for me. And so when there are a number of, in the pipeline, a number of major transformative initiatives at the municipal, provincial, and federal levels, let's make sure that, we bring that settlement lens that Chris was talking about, yeah? And then I think I go back to my earlier point, which is, if we take the social determinants of health approach to this work in settlement, we would have actually the opportunity to link to major policy files in the country that affect our communities, whether it's the poverty reduction agenda federally, social finance agenda, or any like the provincial government here in Ontario or the city government in Toronto, they have already released their recovery plans and documents, yeah? So I think it's an opportunity for us to pick those and say, hey, let's have a cross-sectoral conversation about this and how do we amplify some of the things that we want to see.
Thank you so much. So I think, in discussing transformation, we've hit on two important areas, one around equity and inclusion, and the other around technology. So where those intersect, I'm thinking about, let's talk about access to technology and the challenges that we face as a sector in building our technology systems. But also let's talk about our clients. And even when we have all the systems in place, not everyone can access online services. Let's talk about digital literacy and access and the digital divide. Maybe you can talk about that. I'll open that up to each of the panelists to look at how that relates to transformation post-pandemic. jump in.
Well, I think this is the redefining moment. Our work with newcomers is going to be clearly defined through that digital transformation lens, the digital literacy. Mm-hmm. This is the new reality. And not only will that impact our clients, but also our agencies. Again, going back to capacity, unequal capacity to address this. And so we know that in-person services will always be a core component of our service delivery, and that there will continue to be a cohort of newcomers that will not have access to technology and be able to access online services. This is where I think we need to have a pan-Canadian advocacy approach. And it's not just newcomers, it's seniors, it's other members of society. This is where I think we need a more broad-based coalition advocacy support as government accelerates their digital transformation, online services and so forth, and our frontline staff are having to spend hours waiting on a phone, on behalf of a client. This has to change. And this requires high-level coordinated discussions from a pan-Canadian perspective.
Mm-hmm. That's very much in line with what I was going to say, which is that I would caution against a piecemeal approach. I think there's sort of been some great sort of local initiatives that have emerged out of COVID, with negotiations with private service providers to make sure that a particular group of newcomers has access to Wi-Fi and to internet, or, trying to negotiate piecemeal technology with the private sector or through the municipality. I think those have value in terms of immediate response and trying to plug those gaps, but they are not the way forward. I think we need a national level strategy and a national level sort of understanding of where the issues actually are. There has to be a massive investment in infrastructure. There has to be an investment in government restructuring its services so they'll become truly accessible online. There has to be an acknowledgement that access to internet, both, in rural areas of Canada and in the city, is a human right. If that's how we're delivering services moving forward, then people have to have access. And it can't be that their income is a barrier or they live in an area without coverage. It really, it's sort of, I think it's a really huge piece, and it does have to be done on a national level.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. I think that we actually, ONN, added the issue of rural internet and access to internet as one of our policy priorities this year during COVID, because we were hearing from so many nonprofits and charities, not only was rural internet a problem and inaccessible internet a problem across the country for those, or across the province for those organizations, and we know across the country as well, but for the people that they serve, so the communities that they serve, and the school boards. This has obviously been a huge issue for them as well. So there are, in that case, there are so many allies on the technology side, in the private sector, in government, people that want to see changes made to how internet access works, how technology works, and access to the equipment and the training we would need. I would add that, one of the things that, we're most concerned about, even if we got, donations of fantastic equipment and suddenly internet access was free and available, our sector's behind on the digital skills and on the digital literacy as well. So we need to think about how we invest in the skills that we need in our sector, in the people that we have now, and the new positions perhaps that we need to go forward. So it's a combination of policy and funding the infrastructure, of access to the actual technology, and then of the digital skills that we think are needed for the future.
Yeah, I agree. I think the only thing that I would add perhaps is trying to link this with this whole discussion on the future of work and what it means for us as a sector to really invest in the skill building of the sector itself in terms of digital literacy. The quick other piece that without elaborating that I would add is for us to consider as we talk about digital inclusion and literacy is the whole issue of data privacy. Yeah. What are some things that we need to really think? In Ontario here, we have a group that comes together under the Cathy, what's that? The data.
Administrative coalition.
Exactly. So there is a data coalition that has been meeting for quite some time now. So I think if there is intention and attention to really increase inclusion, but also address privacy issue would be important, yeah.
And that's why it's so important within the sector with the new recently launched Settlement and Technology Task Group, as well as the upcoming IRCC technology survey is really going to give us an opportunity to take a step back and reflect and determine exactly, where are we as a sector vis-a-vis not only our clients, but also our own, infrastructure needs, the privacy, the data management, and professional development. We assume that when we pivoted, when the lockdown was, we gave our staff, a quick, orientation to Zoom and said, go off and do your thing. Staff are still struggling with technology themselves. So this has to be recognized. And these two initiatives, I think, will help at least provide a baseline understanding from a pan-Canadian perspective of where we are.
I guess the final thing I'd just like to add on this topic is that I think it's really key that we actually continue to talk to those who are not accessing services remotely as well. Yeah. I see a lot of surveys in the sector being done sort of with service providers, and I think that's very important. But we really need to be listening to those folks who, for whatever reason, the transition didn't work for. So either they stopped being our clients or they never got connected with those services to begin with, and we need to figure out why, so that we end up addressing the right problem.
So I think in terms of technology, the future model would be sort of a hybrid model where we have access to both. And I think it's not sort of a, complete one way or the other. I'm just going to move along. There was a question from the audience, Cathy, just on who are these allied tech partners that you spoke about?
Well, for example, when we were thinking about advocating for access to internet across Ontario, so rural internet as well, there are a number of other advocacy organizations in the business and public sector communities. So some of the unions, the Chamber of Commerce, actually, that's one of their policy priorities. Some of the Rural Ontario Institute that does a number of initiatives around rural Ontario, so that there's a number of allies that are asking for exactly the same thing. We know also in that case, our local MPPs and MPs in rural areas are huge allies for rural internet access, and can share those stories and open up doors for advocacy. So I think it's taking a look at, in the private sector, in the public sector, in the government sector. On the tech side, there are a number of companies like Rogers, like TELUS. Some of you all have partners with them that are donating, resources, phones to kids that don't have access to cell phones in certain areas. But I agree with Paulina that there's a stopgap measure, and then there's a system-wide approach. And we all did what we had to do for a stopgap measure for the clients that we serve. And now it's time to think about, what did we learn from that experience? Who are some potential allies, and how can we take a bigger sort of sector-wide approach?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Cathy. And that's a good segue into our next question, which is what we're seeing is that all levels of government have put forth a range of policies, supports in response to the pandemic with an eye on recovery. Some people think the policies are too extensive and far-reaching, while others think that not enough is being done. And I'll start with Chris. You spoke a little bit earlier about policies such as immigration levels, planning, and broadening service eligibility as just two examples of policy areas. If you could give one suggestion to government at any level, federal, provincial, or municipal, on what should be done to improve the situation, what would your recommendation be?
So let's go back. We can all probably relate to this. When the lockdown happened and our clients began calling us because they were unemployed or the government-assisted refugee or privately sponsored refugee that landed in 2019 and hadn't filed their income tax. It was a navigational nightmare for frontline staff trying to understand what benefit would work with what client group. You had provincial rental subsidies. There was a whole mishmash of supports put in place. For me, the biggest thing would be to advocate for universal basic income, period. We have seen this around the world now, and leading economists coming out strongly saying that universal basic income, you know, a cash transfer makes a huge difference. Here in Canada, we had the example and pilot in Manitoba. We had, unfortunately, the starting of a pilot in Ontario that was cut short by your new provincial government. But Alaska has had cash transfers for years. This is a new reality, and universal basic income, the reports and research really articulate that basic income tends to boost happiness, increase health, increase student attendance. There is greater trust in social institutions, and it reduces crime. I think that this would be the biggest breakthrough if we were able to come together as a society with the federal government and provincial territorial governments and push for a universal basic income.
I absolutely agree. I watched the government trying to put in sort of individual measures, you know, the changes to the EI, the extension to the CRB, the new CRB benefit. And I attend these webinars which talk about the complexities and how nobody's really sure who's eligible, who's not eligible. They're trying to roll it out. I look at all of that and I think just create a universal basic income. You could just fix this problem, right? I guess the one word of caution though is that the universal basic income has proponents on both the left and the right. And some of the proponents on the right see it as a way of replacing all existing social programming. And I don't think that that would be a good thing.
No.
I think we need to be very clear that yes, we want a universal basic income. That doesn't mean that a lot of the social programs in place then become unnecessary.
Yeah.
Any other comments or recommendations to any levels of government?
Well,
for me, go on, Cathy.
Oh, from a nonprofit sector, from a charity perspective, I would say that, you know, it is time to look at how charities and nonprofits are regulated federally. You know, what the definition of charity looks like. You know, allowing us to earn income that goes back into mission. Allowing shared platforms so that we can support grassroots and community-based initiative, that many which are primarily either youth-based or Black-led or people of color-led organizations. So I think there are some systemic issues federally at the regulation and policy level to allow nonprofits and charities to be able to do the work that they so need to do in their communities. And the other recommendation I would have would be for government funders around really committing to longer term funding, 3 to 5 year funding, general operating dollars, you know, the flexibility to spend the money on the, you know, the services that we want to do for the outcomes that we want, rather than as Chris has already given some examples to, you know, the arbitrary lines in the sand on March 31st each year when we struggle with that. So those are two of the systemic issues I'd love to see that affect how the sector operates.
I agree. I think the UBI, I think as mentioned by Chris, is critically important. The only thing I would add in terms of a recommendation to governments and funders is, like, you know, as much as we are calling for collaboration and cohesion in the sectors, we need also to encourage, you know, united ways and different levels of governments and foundations to really look at a smart grant making. Smart grant making for me has core funding or general operating support funding as a pillar, but has also other aspects to it. It's just like, you know, moving away from, you know, a siloed approach to funding community-based organizations and creating this competitive environment to where you can say, let's use a quadrant approach, let's use a regional approach, whatever approaches that you take of a scale that brings ecosystem, a number of players to work together. So you need to start funding collaboration. You need interfaces of those relationships rather than just, the discrete programs and services. And I think they can do it. They have seen, we have all seen in this pandemic that they have bent a lot of their own rules to do things that they have never imagined to do. So if there's a will, there's a way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I have one last question, but I think I'm going to hold on that and just take a look at some of the questions that are coming in from the audience. It's just 1 o'clock. I think we'll spend another, we'll try to wrap up before the full 2 hours. But we have still another half an hour. So I'm going to start with a question that is really looking at or asking about the importance of having diversified funding, I think, as a capacity building strategy. And it's something you touched on, Cathy, but how do you see social enterprise and social businesses shaping the sector as we move forward?
Mm-hmm. Such a great question. And this is one of the surprising things I think about the pandemic. In the last 10 years, nonprofits and charities have been encouraged to diversify their funding and set up social enterprises and, create business models that allow for more fees for service. And ironically, in the pandemic, those were the organizations that have been hurt the most because they relied on program fees of participants that couldn't show up, or rental income because they had a shared space, or ticket booth sales, or the sale of goods and services like our friends at Goodwill or some of those organizations. And so the ones that actually did well in the first 3 to 6 months of the pandemic were the ones that had, more than 70% government or core funding from a funder like a government or a United Way. So, which is interesting considering that we've been told for 10 years that if we diversify and have more social enterprises, we'll actually be stronger. So definitely though, going forward, social enterprise and diversified revenue does have a place. There are opportunities to do it better and well. Certainly we know from our examples from the UK, particularly from Scotland, who's far ahead on social enterprise policy and strategy, is that at the end of the day, most social enterprises still need some sort of core support, whether they're employing people with disabilities or whether they are, it really is a different kind of revenue model for them. And so it's not the panacea. I think we thought it might have been, 5 to 10 years ago, but there needs to be better strategies and better supports to allow nonprofits and charities to do social enterprise and retain those earnings. We no longer, for example, have a social enterprise strategy in Ontario, and that's something we'd like to see. And often nonprofits and charities aren't eligible for programs for small business development. So why not? We should be eligible for the same programs for business development that other small businesses are as well, or similar programs. So definitely it's been an interesting moment for the social enterprise ecosystem, but some opportunities to continue to grow that work going forward.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Cathy. Chris, you started talking about agreements, funding agreements, and the importance of us having greater flexibility in terms of transferring between years. And so somebody is putting that question out to us and to you specifically in terms of what we can do to advocate for greater flexibility and the challenges that we might face. Yeah.
Again, I think that we have worked together collaboratively, CISA, ACSE, and OCASI, to really put forward and articulate both the issues and solutions and suggestions. That's a key approach, this collaborative, pragmatic piece. We were the ones that came up with this notion of decoupling our admin fee from program delivery. I mean, it's simple, but the department came around with it, and this is something now that they're considering now going forward as part of new functional guidelines. We need, because we are, up to the, crocodiles with managing contribution agreements and this micromanagement and reinvestment requests for, common needs. I mean, it's crazy to think that in 2020, we can't build more flexibility in how we are managing taxpayer funds. It's not about reducing the accountability. It's about taking and implementing and pushing for the implementation of that risk management matrix. If we are delivering services in our community and we've been doing it for 30 years and we've had financial monitors, why should we be judged similar to a new provider? It doesn't make sense. So I think that we have to come together as we are now. IRCC has now set out a call through a variety of providers and umbrellas around the program reset. As a way of, again, coming together pan-Canadian to look at a couple of main pieces that we can push for. I really believe that this notion of controlling the money that we have spent months negotiating and hold in our contribution agreements, that we should have the ability to carry it over from one fiscal year to another without going through this last quarter, forensic spending or decommissioning discussions. We really need to come to terms with this. And this is not new. It's being done in other parts of the federal government. Global Affairs has been doing this for decades. So why can't IRCC do it? We really need to push on this one.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Chris. And I appreciate the work that you are doing through the National Settlement and Integration Council. And that we have taken, as you mentioned, some great steps forward. We now have 5-year agreements as opposed to the maximum 3 in the past. And I think there has been some flexibility already introduced in the ability to move money between lines and so on. But another question that's coming through, so along the same lines, is really about how we can work with our government partners to really look at even longer term funding and core funding as opposed to project-based and short-term funding.
Yeah.
And I open that up to you, Chris,
Right.
but also other.
I mean, it's not like we're not doing this. I mean, many of us represented through the provincial umbrellas and the national forums have been banging away at this for decades. I mean, this goes back to the Blue Ribbon Panel and grants and contribution paper. I think that sometimes it feels that we're spinning our wheels, but if you look backwards over time, we are having impact. We are having breakthroughs, and I think it's times like this where we need to pause, take a step back at a pan-Canadian perspective, and really isolate some key areas that we think are going to have the biggest impact, and take the vulnerability of where IRCC is currently at now. I mean that in the sense of they're only working at 60% capacity. So, this is an opportunity to really put forward a small number of areas that we could really have significant impact, and that would allow us to build on our work that we have done collaboratively together.
If I can just add to what Chris has been saying, I think we need to remember that long-term funding has to go hand in hand with long-term planning as well. And so I think that's why so many of us were excited when we saw the multiple year levels, immigration levels planning, right? Because that made our planning processes easier. That said, during the last CFP application process, I have heard a lot of comments from service providers saying they have found it difficult to plan for 5 years ahead, to budget for 5 years ahead. But I think in a lot of cases, that's because of the level of detail that IRCC requires of our budgets, which at the end of the day is not necessary, because we end up renegotiating at all all of that anyways. So I think what this goes back to is Chris's core point that we need a culture shift. We need sort of a culture of trust with IRCC that would enable us to say, look, this is what we generally want to do with the money that you're giving us, and we will be accountable for it, but don't micromanage us, because we cannot plan 5 years out in the same level of detail that we would plan 1 year out, and that's not a reasonable request. And I do think they're trying to move in that direction. They are, you know, in terms of moving money year to year, for example, they have piloted that. They did roll that out in terms of the grants. So there is some precedent for arguing to now move that to all contribution agreements, right? I think it just goes back to this culture, this reset, the sector reset of getting IRCC to treat us like partners and not like somebody who needs to be policed all the time.
Our admin fee.
Go on, Chris.
Our 15% admin fee, we've advocated that and now have that in place. But why is it still connected to program delivery and capital assets? If we spend months negotiating and dissecting what the admin fee is, which is the basis of the health of the agency, then why can't we move the admin fee into essentially core funding? So you negotiated 15%, regardless of what happens on the ground with program delivery, the agency can take that to the bank. I mean, there's little things like that.
I wonder if there's an opportunity here to also call upon some political allies in Ottawa, you know, like folks in the Senate of Canada that are looking at the relationship between, you know, the sector and government. So maybe there's an opportunity here to really bring up this from a policy perspective and see if there's a boost that comes from political allies in Ottawa.
Absolutely. Like the policy around temporary foreign workers or temporary residents as part of an IRCC eligibility, CISA AXE went and engaged, you know, the federal NDP critic on that, briefed, you know, got her to write a letter to the minister. You know, I think it requires the multi-pronged approach, and that's bringing in those, you know, political allies to help articulate our message.
Or the work that Senator Ratna Omidvar is doing on the diversifying of governance, for example, you know, which is leading potentially for Stat Canada to be involved. So I think there is some opportunity to really amplify the work that settlement sector leaders are doing in this area.
So Amanuel, that actually hits right on a question that I'm seeing in the chat from the audience. And it's sort of recognizing that there's different groups, you know, OCASI, the National Settlement Council, ONN. There's lots of different groups that are working on COVID recovery. But do you think that there's an opportunity or a need to establish a separate and sort of maybe pan-Canadian committee that really focuses in specifically on post-COVID recovery, maybe combining different players and stakeholders?
I'm kind of wary of creating structures, as Cathy was alluding earlier on, but I am in different tables and conversations around recovery. And this is one of few. And I think I ask myself, what do we need to do to connect the dots here? Yeah? And perhaps I'm thinking loud here, Cathy, you know, the Imagine Canada sector table, for example, that they need to have some sort of representation from the settlement sector there, yeah? Or the amazing work that you've been leading in terms of looking for a stabilization fund here in Ontario, or there could be similar other efforts in other provinces. It's almost like you need to get the sector leads to be able to talk to each other. Is that a committee or is that a series of meetings? Whatever it is, I think there is a need to actually, converge the different conversations that are happening around recovery. And the time is right because at least here in Ontario or in the city, governments are releasing their reports and plans for recovery.
That's great. And that touches on actually the last question that I had planned, which is really about building allies and allyship and how we go about doing that. Again, I think just this panel and this conference is a great opportunity to talk about that. And as you mentioned, Amanuel, there is lots happening, but is there something more that we can do around building those allyships?
I think one of the things that I heard my panelists talking about, let's try and I think as we try, we're going to make mistakes, yeah. And I think the need to make intelligent mistakes is important, yeah. Mistakes that we can learn from. And I think when we talk about, I always say in these conversations and engagements, we are in it together. So I think those of us who would like to see the sector to be more inclusive, more equitable, we have, I think, the ethical responsibility to be there to provide support so that intelligent mistakes are done rather than just mistakes, yeah? And I think I also said earlier on that, and Chris alluded to this, we need to develop the fiber to have difficult but necessary conversations among ourselves. And if we do that with care and empathy, then we are all better off for it. So I think for me, in terms of allyship, I'm the one, like Debbie and others, that are saying, you know, we cannot just talk about anti-racism. We must talk about anti-Black racism. And it's my responsibility to make sure that my sector allies here have the tools to really be on the shared understanding what do we mean by anti-Black racism. So when we are demanding for change, it's our responsibility also to be there to support in the process of change. But beyond just issuing statements, I think there's a need to really go through a systematic, strategic review of everything that we do as leaders in the sector.
Great, thank you.
I would echo that for sure. And I think, you know, being allies and thinking about allyship really requires both empathy and humility. And knowing that, you know, I'd love if I only made intelligent mistakes. I'm sure we've all made some dumb mistakes as well as the intelligent ones. But, you know, if we focus, you know, I love that framework from Amanuel, because that allows us to think about, you know, what can we bring to the table? What do we need to learn? What do others have that could help us along, you know, our journey? Because it is a journey, as Chris mentioned, in terms of finding allies and working on systemic things. You know, but to end really practically, like one of the challenges that our sector has is we don't make space in our work plans and our day-to-day work to do systemic relationship building kind of work. You know, it's at the end of the day, or it's off the side of our other network, or to, you know, participate in, you know, in another conversation. So we need to really challenge ourselves to make sure it's part of what our sector does is advocate and do system change and find allies. So that's actually, you know, it becomes part of what we're, you know, compensated for. It becomes part of what our boards are looking for. It becomes part of what our boards are responsible for. So it gives us more ability to spend our time, which is our precious commodity that we have in the sector, on bigger things that might make a difference to the day-to-day work eventually.
And don't lose sight of the fact of what our mission and mandates are as immigrant serving agency. I mean, as I said, we're nation builders. We are the proponents of social cohesion and integration. And so it's from this unique place that we have in our local communities, you know, across Ontario or Canada. It is challenging, you know, post-COVID economic recovery initiatives of the provincial and municipal government. It's always coming to the table through a settlement-informed and integration lens to challenge when these, you know, positions, when these discussions are happening. Have you considered a settlement-informed lens? Because it has ultimately been the clients that we serve who have been impacted the greatest by COVID in many ways.
I just want to shift gears back a little to the topic about racism and anti-Black racism, and just looking inwards a little bit into our sector and the work that we do. Some of the questions I'm kind of combining that I'm seeing from the audience. So one of the questions is around, you know, the fact that we serve immigrants and racialized minorities. In that group of people, there isn't a lot of knowledge and awareness about white supremacy, about racism, about anti-Black racism. What can we do to really expose and look at a strategy for how do we educate and expose our clients and people within our sector regarding that. And that sort of overlaps with another question that I'm seeing around specific cases where people have faced even our clients refusing service, maybe from a Black staff person or somebody for whatever their reasons are related to racism. How do we tackle those issues internally?
I mean, I think from an agency, the courageous discussion, it starts with courageous discussions, creating at the senior level a framework in which to engage this and understand that we are all racist, that Canada is a racist society, and being able to, through a concerted ongoing effort, to understand what practices and policies we may inadvertently have that are racist, microaggressions, to be able to have tables and structures and education as part of this journey to better understand and reflect on our own practices, and that of our staff, better understanding the history of racism. But it's very much a journey. I know that, Debbie and I, when we launched the National Compensation Survey and this whole notion of better understanding issues of, racial data within the immigrant serving agency was something that the sector wasn't completely on board with across the country. How many of our staff are foreign-born, gender diversity, and so forth. I think it is all part and parcel of this multi-pronged approach and journey. But it really starts, I think, an acknowledgement of positions of power and launching and leading courageous discussions, knowing that there is no, end point that will be fraught with speed bumps and, potentially unintended, misinterpretation and so forth, but it has to begin somewhere.
So I would second everything that Chris has said. And also I would like to add specifically with regards to the ideas that newcomers come with to Canada. I do think that there's an obligation on the part of the sector to ensure that they don't absorb the Canadian prejudices, and that discussion happens among newcomers as well. And that has been a conversation for some time in the sector with regards to anti-Indigenous racism specifically, right? This idea that the relationships need to be fostered between newcomer communities and Indigenous communities, because otherwise it becomes very easy to turn those communities against each other, right? Newcomers absorb racist stereotypes, and Indigenous communities already feel wronged, and they feel often like newcomers are privileged over them. It makes it very easy to set them against each other, set two marginalized communities against each other. So there have been sort of systems level attempts to incorporate more of that education into the newcomer experience. I know that the same is happening with regards to anti-racism. I know that OCASI, I believe, has fought really hard for amendments to the citizenship guide, for instance, to make sure that at least newcomers find out about the history of Indigenous people and the history of Black people in Canada. There's varying levels of success to that. I think a lot more needs to be done, but I think it does again need to happen on a kind of systemic wide level. And there are a lot of entry points into it. I would love to see that as part of the linked curriculum, for instance, and there's other places where it could be inserted as well.
I think quickly, again, I agree what Chris and Paulina shared. We need to institutionalize these interventions. And by that, I mean, we need to figure out, as sector organizations working with government and other institutions, we need to be able to almost mainstream this approach so that, those organizations that are in need of support and leaders, they can access the tools. There's a lot of support already. Here in Toronto, we have a fantastic anti-Black racism unit at the City of Toronto that could be a huge resource to support other cities and municipalities. That's why last week at our anti-Black racism conference, we had a particular session on how do we take this work pan-Canadian, supporting other municipalities. Yeah. The other quick comment that I would add here is that, Paulina, it's your point in terms of our responsibility, again, Manjeet's point in terms of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We must find a way to really integrate in everything that we do with newcomers, the notion that we are all treaty people. We need to really understand what does that actually mean to be treaty people in concrete ways. And I think we need to be able to really work hand in glove with our Aboriginal brothers and sisters, the sector leaders there, to find concrete ways to really make this thing, we are all treated people, a meaningful experience. What does it mean? What can I do when I'm a person of the treaty in my own locus of control? So these are some of the things that come to mind, but institutionalizing our responses would be critically important.
Thank you so much, Amanuel. I'm just very mindful of the time. I thought 2 hours was going to be a very long time, but it does seem to go by fairly quickly. I'm just mindful of the fact also that the title of this panel was Dare to Dream. And I know that we are in a very scary time, a very uncertain time. Many of us had plans in place. We tried to, identify all the different risks that we face. And I don't know if many of us thought a pandemic was one of the risks that we should plan for. So I do want to leave, though, on a very optimistic sort of point or place. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists, maybe just in about 15 seconds each, or 15 to 30 seconds, share with us something, your thoughts, your reflections on something optimistic that we should look forward to and plan for. I'll start with Cathy.
Okay, well, I definitely think that the future is the nonprofit sector. The nonprofit sector has huge opportunities to transform the way that we see the economy and the social economy, as well as the economy, and how we deal with some of the big issues facing us today, from racial justice to climate justice. So I do believe that there's huge opportunity for the sector, and that it is the transformation, the moment that we're in. There'll be some great things coming out of it, and we have to start thinking about what could those great things be and work towards them, rather than look backwards about what was. And so I think that really is the optimism for me, that things are going to change, that we are going to lose some organizations, we are going to see different ways of doing business, and let's drive the change we want to see, rather than wait for it to be done to us.
Thank you, Cathy. How about you, Chris?
I think it's a recognition of what we already know, and that is in the sector's DNA has always been resilience, flexibility, innovation. We don't need SDI to tell us what we're innovating. We've been innovating for years. We have faced huge challenges in the past. This is another challenge, a different challenge, but I think we have to be reflect and be and understand what is our part of our core DNA, and continue to engage in practical, pragmatic ways with government to find win-win situations.
Thank you, Chris. Paulina?
I think for me, I was pleasantly surprised by the recognition among decision makers, not necessarily among the broader public, but among decision makers, that immigrants are absolutely key to this country. And there may be bumps in the road ahead, but the demographic realities are such that immigrants are hugely important. Canada can't survive without them. And that means that Canada needs the settlement sector, the immigrant serving sector. I was very heartened to find that the immigrant serving sector was declared an essential service. And we actually have found, at least I believe we found that our funders, our federal funders, have been quite supportive up to date and reassuring in their recognition of our importance and our place in the ecosystem. Now, that doesn't mean that there are no risks ahead. It doesn't mean there won't be funding cuts, but I was very encouraged by the fact that there seems to be a recognition that this is an absolutely key sector.
Thank you so much, Paulina. Amanuel, your final thoughts?
I think building on Paulina, I think the settlement sector for me, and Chris made a point about this. I've always regarded the settlement sector as an important contributor to social cohesion and nation building in Canada. So obvious on many fronts for me. So what we need to do in terms of really positioning the sector to be a leader in the transformation that we need to see, we need to be able to really continue shifting the mindsets of leaders and shifting in such a way that people don't get lost in the trees, that pay attention to the forest. The ecosystem is important. So we need to have settlement sector leaders in those important sectoral and national tables to drive the discussion about social cohesion and nation building in this country. So I'm, from what I have seen over the years and what I see now, there's an ample opportunity for settlement sector leaders to actually be at the forefront leading. What we need to do is, as we said in this panel, we need to be intentional about breaking those sectoral silos that exist at the moment, other than that, I think the adversity of the moment is an opportunity, and there's an opportunity to really be bold and move ahead.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the time that you've given to us, the panelists. I feel very privileged to be amongst such a group of experts and people with so much passion for the work that we do. And I think that with all of your insights and your optimism, we can dare to dream to come out of this very difficult time stronger and better than ever. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you to
Thanks
our wonderful panelists and our moderator, Manjeet, Dhiman. The feedback has been tremendous. Folks think that you're all the best thing since sliced bread or fire, whichever one you want to use. So looking forward to a continued conversation as we go through this week at OCASI's Executive Directors Forum. Shout out again to our funders, IRCC, MCCSS, and United Way of Greater Toronto. And I would be remiss if I didn't use this last 10 seconds to do a commercial for OCASI. For organizations who are not yet signed up, please join the OCASI client management system. There you go. Send an email to trapez@ocasi.org. That's TRAPEZ@ocasi.org for more information. Enjoy your afternoon. For those of you attending active citizenship this afternoon, you're going to have a fabulous time helping to shape what that looks like for Canada. For others, have a great and fantastic afternoon, and I will see you tomorrow morning. Enjoy. Thank you again, panelists. This has been a great conversation.